In Siegfried Krakauer's 1947 book on the development of Weimar cinema, From Caligari to Hitler, A Psychological History of the German Film, Krakauer sees the medium as uniquely capable of reflecting not so much explicit credos as psychological dispositions, those deep layers of collective mentality which extend more or less below the dimension of consciousness. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, scholars rushed to make sense of how the German people served as a base onto which Hitler could ascend, how their psychological dispositions were affected by popular culture, music, and film.
Let my people go!
Krakauer specifically formulated an argument premised on Weimar cinema as a reflection of a tortured and menacing, even proto-fascist German soul. The excerpts of the 1920 film by Paul Wagner just shown, The Golem, How He Came into the World, can certainly lead one to form such conclusions. It displays common anti-Semitic tropes, such as the idea of the wandering Jew, Jews as a powerful, even mystic people, and the Jewish denigration of supposed innate Germanic values, to name a few. But it would be a mistake to say all Weimar cinema points forward to fascism. For one, this argument ignores high levels of Jewish participation in the German film industry, the works of left-wing and progressive filmmakers, and the overall contradictory cultural force that was Weimar cinema. Secondly, it doesn't account for the fact that Hitler largely saw Weimar film in its totality as a destructive cultural force. Finally, it feeds into a common myth that the Weimar Republic was ill-equipped for democracy and doomed to fail from the outset. But it is also hard to believe that Weimar film existed in a vacuum, in that it left German culture untouched by its messaging and dominant themes. Accounting for these gaps, I argue that Weimar cinema's representations of Jewishness served as both a reflection and projection of dominant Weimar attitudes. In this way, the medium existed as a mirroring of cultural reactions to key issues such as modernity, inflation, and the trauma of World War I. But as Ofer Ashkenazi explains, it was also the site of a continual interaction between Jews and non-Jews, often delivering competing visions of German nationalism and different markers of who is in and who is out of the German cultural imaginary. We will first start with cultural reflections through film, and with what Anton Kayes calls Weimar's shell-shocked cinema. Kayes asserts that the classical cinema of Weimar Germany is haunted by the memory of a war whose traumatic outcome was never officially acknowledged, let alone accepted. Feelings of betrayal, of being stabbed in the back by the home front, and the contemplation of utter defeat often manifested in melodrama, myth, or science fiction. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in 1920, is the height of German expressionist cinema, centering around Dr. Caligari's use of hypnosis to commit a string of violent crimes. It illustrates the returning soldier's feeling of alienation from German society and a descent into madness. Realist depictions of war through film often neglected these deeply personal feelings, to some making The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari the ultimate war film. As Modris Eksteins writes, traditional language and vocabulary were grossly inadequate, it seemed, to describe the trench experience. The golden age of German film thus largely owes its existence to reactions to war and expressionism as a means to convey a soldier's true, unvarnished experiences. Benjamin Carter Head said, "Everything about the Weimar Republic was really about the First World War. It is only with this context can one begin to analyze Jewish representations in Weimar cinema. Of course, examples of anti-Semitic tropes in 19th century Europe abound, but the defeat in war, to many, was a direct result of Jewish desertion and a lack of loyalty to the German cause." The 1922 film, Dr. Mabuse, the Gambler, created during the period of German hyperinflation that invoked a crisis of modernity, serves as a good point of analysis. For some, the inflationary period inflicted misery, for others, prosperity, With the devaluation of a key source of collective and individual identity, all that remained was the frequently dull, sometimes euphoric, and often terrifying present. The film reflects this feeling of the absurdity caused by inflation and the widespread reactions to it. Its lead is perhaps the quintessential stereotype of the Jew. Dr. Mabuse controls minds, is wealthy, unscrupulous, always in disguise, and gains off the suffering of others. And it was accepted as such. In its review, a popular German newspaper declared the film a kind of cultural historical document, a characteristic portrayal of the years immediately after World War I with all their peculiar features. It will give people, 100 years from now, an idea of an age that they could hardly comprehend without such a document. Dr. Mabuse, Bernd Wittig argues, is the embodiment of inflationary money. He cannot be trusted. His circulation is unpredictable and causes destruction wherever he appears. Dr. Mabuse, the Jew, is presented here as a threatening force. He takes advantage of a sense of lawlessness and cultural anarchy to achieve his aims. In his analysis, Krakauer declared Dr. Mabuse a tyrant film. He argued that the Germans obviously held that they had no choice other than the cataclysm of anarchy or a tyrannical regime. While these depictions of Jewishness and chaos during the period of hyperinflation certainly reflect common Weimar attitudes, Krakauer's inference here is dubious. That the Nazis used the film to demonstrate an example of an image of the eternal Jew is not indicative of a collective yearning for authoritarianism. The injured Weimar state, contrary to popular assumptions, was quite resilient. It survived hyperinflation, the Ruhr crisis, an attempted coup by the far-right Freikorps, to which the German population heavily resisted, and numerous assassinations of its most heralded diplomats and leaders. Whereas Krakow views the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Dr. Mabuse as a representation of Germany's subconscious need for a tyrant, in Kathleen Canning's analysis, the failure of the Weimar state ultimately resulted not from a desire for authoritarianism, but from the fact that citizens' expectations of both the political system and its politicians were unrealistically high and were thus essentially doomed to be disappointed. So, with the representations of Jewishness we have seen so far, why did Hitler write in Mein Kampf that there was a poison among the people, spreading to the theater and the cinema? If Weimar cinema pointed to fascism, as Krakauer suggests, why did the Nazis exert such meticulous control over the industry once in power? Barbara Hales and other scholars on the subject would point to films, perhaps lesser-known ones, that emphasize more cosmopolitan visions for German society, which Hitler could conveniently blame on Judeo-Bolshevism. Indeed, cinema was a site where Jewish cultural endeavor integrated into the mainstream in a way that emphasized cooperation and downplayed differences between Jews and non-Jews. Here we are presented with a dichotomy. The golden age of German filmmaking concurred with an unprecedented growth in anti-Semitic tendencies. It manifested in the production of both liberal and illiberal films. The films that espoused Jewish integration in German society were often comedies. Henry Bergson writes that humor has the social functions of solidifying the sense of belonging to a community. The humorous films of Ernst Lubitsch use it to demonstrate stories of its protagonists overcoming a sense of otherness. In Meyer from Berlin, directed and starring Lubitsch, Sally Meyer is a middle-class Jewish man from Berlin. Tricking his wife into letting him go on vacation in the German countryside to court other women by convincing a doctor to prescribe him fresh air, he attempts to shed his Jewish identity and assimilate into German society. But his efforts are fruitless. His attempted integration is obvious, sticking out like a sore thumb among the German aristocrats. We are not laughing at Meyer, though. Meyer is remarkably charming, outcompeting other German suitors for the most beautiful women in the upscale hotel. The jokes come from the difference between Meyer's charm and the insular, stuffy, aristocratic men. When asking directions to a mountain to hike, the locals ridicule Meyer, repeatedly saying to him to follow your nose, playing on the stereotype of Jews having large, distinct noses. Upon close inspection, the film emphasizes the irrationality of anti-Semitism. In doing so, it projects a more progressive vision of German society to its audience. Viewers can come for the comedy and perhaps leave with a more enlightened outlook. These more liberal depictions of Jewishness didn't just work to incorporate aspects of the Jewish experience into German mainstream culture, it was also part of a broader trend in select Weimar films that provided a specific model of Jewish acculturation into German society. Many Jewish directors and writers rarely explicitly spoke of their heritage, but through a process now defined as double coding, Jewish themes incorporated into their movies were often recognized as such by only Jews themselves or otherwise keen observers. As Ashkenazi says, an acculturated Jew can be a brother to his countrymen and still maintain his otherness. Receiving the full benefits of citizenship often required that middle-class Jews displayed their Germanness in the street while they practiced their religion in the home. In Carl Guhn's The Street, nuance is added to this notion, using film, much like conventional scholarship, as a medium to debate these ideas. With reference to this double coding I mentioned earlier, its protagonist is both a stereotypical Jew and a typical confused urbanite in an era of rapidly changing landscapes and social practices, providing a source for both general entertainment and more pointed social commentary. Guhn's lead is a bourgeois man drawn to the chaos of the street from the window of his apartment. As he ventures into the city, he follows a woman to a nightclub and then to her home. He is soon exposed to its dangers, discovering that the woman is a prostitute who devised a scheme to rob the two naive suitors. When the other man is murdered, our lead is arrested, and while in jail, contemplates suicide, but is interrupted when notified he would be released. The film ends ominously as he returns to the safety of his apartment, stunned. During the period of Jewish Enlightenment, referred to as the Haskalah, debates over Jewish assimilation into European society dominated the religious discourse. In Judah Lieb Gordon's famous 1866 poem, Awake, My People, he said, "This land of Eden is now open to you. Its sons now call you brothers. How long will you dwell among them as a guest? Why do you reject their hand? Be a man in the streets and a Jew at home. Recognize your time and your place." Guhn's film is a product of this ongoing dialogue. It takes Gordon's idealism and demonstrates the difficulty of Jewish acculturation in practice with an allegory of the borders defining who is in and who is out of German society. Not mentioning that the film's director, writers, producers, and set designers were assimilated Jews themselves, Krakauer says that the film merely depicts the German soul transforming from feelings of rebellion, as illustrated by responses to hyperinflation, to a desire to submit to authoritarianism, and in this way feels incomplete. From The Street's take on Jewish assimilation, it's not hard to see why Hannah Arendt described the Jewish experience in Germany as an unrequited love affair. Weimar cinema, like a new form of a town square, both reflected common attitudes, while it challenged the status quo by espousing new, often divergent visions for German society. It wasn't a monolith. While there was certainly a sense that the key to commercial success lay in giving the public what it wants, the sheer amount of scholarship on the ways through which film and media more broadly helped shape modern German identity belies its function as simply a stylized echo chamber. It's an intricate balance. The evolution of culture, Corey Ross suggests, is so difficult to study precisely because of a lack of evidence regarding cause and effect. There's no straight line to be drawn from the advent of the mass media to the fall of the German monarchy or the rise of the Nazis. Weimar films, in the aggregate, showcased a kind of ambivalence. They could be used to justify an almost infinite set of political and religious positions. Where films can't be reduced down to one single allegorical message, and often they can't be, they still help shape the public discourse by anchoring one's views to a widely known point of reference. Look no further than Fritz Lang's Metropolis to demonstrate this point, a hugely influential film that set a precedent for the science fiction, dystopian pictures we enjoy today. It has been famously interpreted by many as a diatribe against consumer culture and capitalism, a criticism of Marxism, and even an embrace of a forthcoming Nazi regime to link the hands and the brain with the heart of the German people, to use the film's own analogy. Hitler was so impressed with the movie that he proposed Lang take charge of the Nazi film industry in spite of his Jewish heritage. Lang refused the offer, fleeing Germany and divorcing his wife, who later went on to work in the regime's tightly controlled film industry. Films like Metropolis thus provided new bases on which existing visions for society could be affirmed. Fixed frameworks that attempt to narrowly theorize cinema's relationship to cultural and political progression are in this way often problematic. In studying film through a historical or sociological lens, hindsight can easily distort the realities on the ground. But one cannot also completely isolate the film industry from the wider sweep of history. To do so is ignorant and dismisses the prospect of adding valuable insights to current debates about the rise of fascism, the making of a totalitarian state, and the nature of anti-Semitism. In this video essay, I've attempted to strike a balance. With reference to ideas of Jewishness presented in Weimar film, cinema often reflected common anti-Semitic tropes, while it was the site of continual interactions both within the Jewish community itself and between Jews and non-Jews regarding the making of a modern German national identity. Films both explicitly presented new conceptions, while also created a hospitable environment through which existing views could be superimposed and legitimized. As I have shown, Caligari, Dr. Mabuse, Meyer in Berlin, and The Street dealt with separate issues, injected distinct themes, and likely had different impacts on German audiences. What Jewishness represented was not just a fascination of anti-Semites, given its proposed linkages to the defeat in war, modernity, and the health of the economy, but a real question within German Jewish circles as well. This adds nuance to discussions of Weimar cinema and further cements it as a valuable topic in the period's rich history.